I'm Kathy Humbarger with Allen County Right to Life, and we've heard some tremendous stories so far. Wouldn't you agree? You know, being pro-life has a price, and all of us have sacrificed something in some way to stand up for the unborn. The stories that you've heard tonight are incredible. But the next speaker I know personally, and I asked if I could please introduce him. Richard Mourdock and I go back a long, long way. I think at least 15 years or so, Richard. I became acquainted with Richard when he was involved with Indiana Right to Life. And so I know that his conviction to life is strong. Most of you are aware that in the last election cycle, Richard paid a huge price for standing firm for his convictions. He was pilloried and made fun of, his words were twisted, and he was abandoned by many friends. So while each of us have paid a unique price, there's no one I know who has paid a bigger price with his career and his life than Indiana State Treasurer Richard Mourdock. And it is indeed my pleasure to introduce him to you tonight and to welcome him to the stage. Over, as you all know, I'm paid by the word, so I don't give it up easily. Many of you have been following the story of the young woman from Elwood who was tragically and violently raped just about 9 months ago. And we've invited her here tonight with her little guy, and I'd like to ask Ashley and Aiden to come to the stage so that Richard can have the privilege of looking into the face of a little child for whom he spoke up last November.
That's the way to be introduced, folks. That's all I can say. So, we can go ahead and have a seat here. Thank you. You know, in fact, let me do this first. Normally when a politician takes off his watch, it means nothing at all. And I do want to keep this meeting on time. And I never thought I would tell this story with Jim Sapel when you commented that most people never think of their conception. You have many incredible experiences when you are in the field of politics and you go from place to place. It was when I was first running for state treasurer that I stopped in Greensburg, Indiana, over in Decatur County at the local newspaper there. And if you've ever been in a newspaper office, you know they love to put up copies of their famous editions. You know, the day Kennedy was assassinated, Man Walks on the Moon. And in a small town paper, especially if there's something important, they put up. And I was there waiting to talk to the editor, and I looked up, and there's a newspaper that says, Greensburg, Indiana, February 8th, 1951, the ice box of the nation. It got down to 28 below zero. And I suddenly did some math. Exactly 9 months later, I was born. So whenever I go to Greensburg, I think of my conception. strange experiences you have as a politician. Well, I want to share my few minutes with you this evening first by, I think, explaining why I'm with this panel. And it is to make the point that the hard cases are a subject of interest to the media. They want to have something to talk about. And they will latch on to the hard cases as that exception every time they get a chance. And I never imagined a year ago right now, as we were leading in the polls, running for the United States Senate, that the issue that we're discussing tonight would become such a pivotal one just a few months down the road. I need to say also just a little bit, if I may, of my own history. In January of 1973, when Roe versus Wade came down to the Supreme Court, I was starting my last semester of college, not many miles from here at Defiance, Ohio. And I don't remember anything about that day. It didn't mean anything to me. Like most young people, I think when Roe versus Wade was ruled by the U.S. Supreme Court, if someone had asked me, I probably would have thought, well, that's a good decision because it gives women choice. But somewhere I started to grow up, and by that I mean spiritually. Over the years, I came to recognize, especially as I came to my faith, that life is something special. And yet, even when I began my political involvement in the late 1980s, I was one of those people who, oh yeah, I'm pro-life, except for rape, incest, life of the mother. And I carried on that attitude and that belief for several years, probably close to 2 decades. And I cannot tell you when there was a particular epiphany, when some moment occurred that caused me to look at it differently. But I'd like to think that that decision, too, was made as a result of my spiritual growth. I came to realize, and I've always thought as a politician, the worst thing of a politician, I don't care if it's Republican or Democrat, and there's politicians of both sides, can demonstrate hypocrisy, and I think there's nothing worse. And I started to think of this issue, and I started to realize I was a hypocrite. Because as special as I would get out and talk and work with Right to Life, as special as I thought life was out there to be created by God, somehow I thought I had the power to say which life and which life was not. And so about 2006, I think, my changing, processing, led me to the point where I say the only exception. And this one is, I think, the inevitable exception, that life of the mother, when you hope you have that trained physician who is truly competent in making the decision for the right reason when the mother's life truly is in danger. I entered the campaign of 2012 with that being my belief. We soldiered through a primary that, frankly, we were told we never had a chance to win. And yet the Right to Life vote was there for us, and we defeated a long-term United States Senator, as all of you know, by huge numbers. We entered into the summer campaign, and we were getting beaten up. If you don't know, the Senate campaign between Mourdock and Donnelly in 2012 was the most expensive political campaign that's ever taken place in Indiana. Each side spent almost $18 million. And you probably remember all the ads. This will surprise you, but I didn't see them. I don't watch them. My skin isn't that thick. And as we kept being beaten up in June, July, and August, and we didn't have any money. We weren't on TV. The other side was. We didn't have any money. And because we just won a primary, and it was tough. And we were told every time we asked the people in D.C. to come help us, oh, you're fine. It's Indiana. You're going to be fine. It's a Republican state. And the polling numbers kept getting tighter and tighter and tighter. One thing that I heard from Labor Day on was we've got to have 75% of the Right to Life vote. We've got to get 75% of the Right to Life vote. Now, I know I had more than 75% of the Right to Life vote from Republicans in the primary. But there are a lot of people who don't consider themselves Republican or Democrat who do think of themselves as Right to Life. And let's be sure there are a lot of Democrats who consider themselves Right to Life. And I knew I had to pull some of those over. I give you that little fact to perhaps explain what was going on subconsciously the night I stood on that platform with Joe Donnelly. And I'll share with you all something that Forgive me, my you all, I've lived in southern Indiana a long time. I will share with you something that I don't normally share with an audience, but knowing the basis of this audience, I will. Before I ever walk to a microphone, before I ever stand before an audience, whether it's a small Rotary group like this afternoon over in Merrillville, or it's just happened here a moment ago, I always pray. And it's not a prayer of rhetoric. It's not the same words every time. But the essence of that prayer is, Lord God, do not let this audience hear my words. Let them hear your truth to me. For whatever reason, and I cannot explain this, on that day of the debate, I got to the studio about 4 hours ahead of time. We were told there were going to be protesters out picketing and potential thoughts of violence and all this. So I wanted to get inside. And obviously you do a lot of prep work. And this is not like me. But throughout that day, I didn't care to read the reports on foreign policy. I didn't care to read the reports on the budget. I didn't care to read the reports on anything. The voice in my head was saying, you need to pray. I prayed for several hours, and that is not like me. But again, the prayer came out the same. You know, Lord, this isn't about me. I don't want this to be about me. Let it be about you. We got into that debate, and frankly, if I dare say so myself, I think I was mopping up the floor. There was polling going on through the debate, and the polling certainly showed that. And then the question came. And I hadn't really prepared for the question. I knew what I believed, and all you have to do is say what you believe. And so I said, as best as I can recall it, and many of you probably recall it more than I do, I said, even in that horrible instance, as brutal, as hard as it is, even in that horrible interest, in that horrible moment, I think that is something God intended. And of course, what I meant to say was I think that life is something that God intended. I walked off the stage that night absolutely convinced I'd won the debate. For 10 minutes, I milled around with my supporters, and they were giving me high fives, but I could tell there was a little caution. I didn't quite get that. And then one of my staff members walked up to me, and the blood was draining from his face, and said, we got to talk. We got to do damage control. And I said, about what? About what you said. What do you mean about what I said? Well, you said God intended for rape to happen. No, I didn't. I said, God intended for that life to happen. No, you didn't say that. Yes, I did. And they quickly showed me the replay. No, I didn't. You know, until the day he died, Neil Armstrong told the story of how that famous quote is wrong. He swore to his dying day that when he set foot on the moon, he said that's one small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind. And somehow in the technology, that little A disappeared. Somehow that word life disappeared, not electronically. I wish I could blame it on that. But it wasn't there. Liz Carl, you commented about the alarm not going off. Was it coincidence? Just a goofy moment? Or was it something greater? I don't know. The next day, needless to say, the firestorm started. If you ever want to know what the bottom of a bus looks like, come see me, I'll tell you. I can tell you the distance from axle to axle. I was told I needed to apologize, and deep down I was saying, no, I don't need to apologize, because I know what I meant to say, my intentions were honorable, and yet I'll clarify it, but I'm not going to apologize. And that next day we had a news conference, and I will never forget as long as I live, walking in, and it was like the news conference the President of the United States has. It was just this crescent shape of Klieg lights. You couldn't see who's behind the lights. And I had that sense, as I was saying, that the God that I worship is a God of peace and love, not a God of violence and harm. And so I would never intend to say that God wants women to be raped and harmed, but I believe God is the author of life. And even as I stood there, I sensed I was standing in a cone of darkness, because I knew the people on the other side of those lights didn't understand the basis from which I was speaking. It was a very frustrating moment. Even now, as I think back at it, my frustration is great. This will probably seem almost unbelievable, but I never read a newspaper article if I know my name is in it. I began that practice long ago down in Vanderburgh County as a county commissioner, and honestly I do it because issues of public policy are difficult. Newspaper writers have to put it down at a 5th or 6th grade level, and there's always leaving something out. And when I used to read the stories and they'd get it wrong and leave something out, I'd get angry with them, and the next time they come, I deal with them differently, and you know what? That's not fair to them. So I don't read the articles. Drove my staff crazy often. About 3 days after the debate, I don't know that I could have been lower in the sense of feeling I'd let down, not my father, but I had let down so many people who believed in me. I'd let down so many who worked so hard. I felt lower than I've ever felt in my life in those 3 days. And should I add also that during those 3 days we received the calls and death threats. You know you've done something that's gotten people's attention when you get home for the first time in 2 weeks at 11 o'clock at night, you pull in your driveway to see an Indiana State Police car there because it's there to guard your wife. You feel bad about that. By the way, how stupid do you have to be to call to leave a death message on a voicemail in the state treasurer's office twice? But as low as I felt during that next 2 to 3 days, a young lady on our campaign suddenly walked up to me as I was getting ready to go before a camera, and she said, "Richard, you got to read this article." I said, "No, I don't read it." "You got to read it." "Is my name in it?" "I don't want to read it." No, you've got to read this article." And the article was written, and I may get the first name wrong, it's either Molly or Maggie Hennenberg for the Washington Post. And it happens that Molly's mother lives in Evansville, where I live. And prior to the primary, she had come down and spent part of a day with me and interviewed me. She had also come in earlier prior to the debate, done a couple questions with me. And she'd written several stories. But the reason Jill wanted me to see this particular article was because it begins, as best I can quote it, by saying, when the editor came to me to ask about the Richard Mourdock story, to write about the Richard Mourdock story, he didn't know that I had met Richard Mourdock. He didn't know that he comes from my hometown. And he also didn't know that I'm a woman who was raped. And then it went on to say that she was liberal and pro-choice. And I'm thinking, why does Jill want me to read this article? And I started through the article, and Ms. Henniger explained how she had written previously that Mourdock would get himself in trouble because he answers questions. He gives reporters thorough answers because he wants the voters to know who he is. She said I was unusual. Forgive me if I take that as a compliment. She retold the story how, because I was running late from a press conference that we had in midsummer, I had to go catch a flight on the way to the airport. I picked up the phone and called her because I said, "I think you've got another question you had to answer, and I just want to answer it." And she said she was shocked because politicians don't do that. And she made the point Mourdock would get himself in trouble. And then she went on to write, as if it were an open letter to the voters of Indiana, to say, if you don't like what Richard Mourdock said, don't vote against him for that reason, because you have to understand Richard Mourdock. In his world, it is very simple. It is black and white. A life is a life is a life. And this is and then she wrote, and this is a quote, "It's for the rest of us in the mushy middle to force ourselves to decide when a life is precious or when it's simply inconvenient." I suddenly realized in reading that there was a national debate taking place right then. I came to realize that there might well be across this country some woman who, through rape or incest or some act of violence at that moment was pregnant and was having to stop and think about this decision. And I thought, God's purpose continues. I am a student of history, and I can't get through any speech without quoting Abraham Lincoln, and you'll have to forgive me for that. But, ironically, in a debate that Mr. Lincoln had, when he was running for the United States Senate, in a race in which he ultimately lost, it was the last of those great series of Lincoln-Douglas debates. It was a beautiful October day in 1858. It was the seventh of the 7 debates. The arguments had gone back and forth, and towards the close of that debate, I have to believe, Abraham Lincoln startled everyone in the audience by saying, effectively, you think we're here to talk about slavery, but we're not. What Abraham Lincoln said, and I quote, is we are here to consider the eternal contest between 2 perpetual principles, right and wrong, good and evil in the world today. That day he went on to describe good as the common rights of humanity. And what he said was evil, in the words of the 19th century, were the divine right of kings, where one man can say to another one, you are my property, you are my slave, and I am your master. Today, I think, more and more people in this country believe what is good is the common right to life. Statistics show we are winning that battle, though certainly in these hard cases we still have a culture to change, and we must not quit. If you had told anyone in that audience that day in 1858 that a few days later, one of those 2 people, or a few years later rather, one of those 2 people would be President of the United States, I'm sure 99% of them would have said it would be Stephen Douglas. In 1863, as President Lincoln was speaking to a group of soldiers from Ohio who were getting ready to go home on leave, and common speculation was there weren't going to be many of them come back. He said the struggle of today is not entirely the struggle for today. It is for something greater. It is for a vast, vast future. We sometimes think when we argue for life that it is simply for that next generation. If you've ever worked at a crisis pregnancy center, you think it's for that developing child and that woman who walked through the door, but it's for much more than that. It is for generation after generation after generation that we must change this culture to accept, yes, that even the hard cases that you've heard of here tonight can represent the beautiful lives that are sitting before you tonight. The eternal contest is not one we're going to win in a few weeks or months for political elections. That's why it's called eternal. Right and wrong, good and evil in the world. I honestly don't know. And we'll never know, though I've certainly asked at least 5 times every day since the day of that debate why it was that I said what I said and why the results turned out to be what they were. But I'm coming to peace with it. Because I keep reminding myself that little prayer is, Lord, this isn't about me. It is about you speaking through me. And I hope all of you, when you have those moments, to talk about the hard cases. If it's difficult for you, just say that prayer for a moment. The words will be there. They will come. You will remember the stories you've heard this evening. And if you do that, I have no doubt that you will celebrate as I have celebrated tonight in meeting this young lady and her beautiful child, In meeting women from the day of the debate until the election and several weeks afterwards who came up to me and told me their stories, and it's funny how they all seem to end with, and now that child's the most beautiful thing in my life, even though they were separated by 16 years or 22 years or 25 years. Life is that gift that we should all work to protect and save. May God bless you all.